Greetings YouTube! In this video I'm going to show you how I made the pattern for these sheepskin boots. Although I've worked with leather before, this is my first time making boots, so there was a bit of trial and error involved. But there's no need to be daunted. If you can sew, you can sew leather. I'm going to show you the whole process of making these boots start to finish, but I'm going to split it up into 3 videos. This first one I'll show you how I made the pattern, and the second one I'll show preparing the leather, and in the final video we'll stitch it all together and do the finishing touches. I've looked at lots of different methods of making boots, including medieval turn shoes and moccasins, and I've put together the methods that have worked for me and come up for a way to make a pattern that fits my foot. And using the same method you can come up with a pattern that will fit your foot. So let's get started. I place my foot on a piece of paper wearing the socks I intend to wear with the boots, and I draw around my foot, keeping the pen perpendicular to the paper. Now I have a rough outline of my foot. I go around cleaning this up, making a line on the outer edge of this outline, making something that's vaguely sole-shaped. Next I put my foot back on the outline and I mark the widest part of my foot, at the joints where my toes meet my foot. And then I mark a little further back, where the ball of my foot lifts off of the paper and becomes the arch. I do this on both sides. You can see I did this a couple of times until I was happy with the placement. The thicker lines are the ones I'm happy with. I take a ruler and I join these marks with 2 lines running crosswise through the sole. And I mark the centre point on each of these lines, measuring in between the outlines of the sole. I then draw a straight line through the length of the sole, going through both those centre marks. Next we need to take some measurements of the foot. First I'm going to put on an extra thick sock. This is to compensate for the fact that sheepskin has a thick woolly layer. First we measure the ball of our foot around the widest part. Mine comes to 9.5 inches. Next we measure around the part of the foot where the arch is. This is also 9.5. We measure the top of the foot from the arch circumference to where the toes meet the floor. Mine is 5 inches. The circumference of the ankle. Mine is 10 inches. From floor to ankle. Mine is 4 inches. The full length of the boot. Mine is 8. And the circumference at the full length. Mine is 10.5. Now we have all our measurements, we're ready to start drawing our pattern. We're going to start with our top of foot measurement. Beginning from our arch line, we're going to measure up our top foot measurement. Mine was 5 inches. And we mark this along the centre line. Next I write down my circumference measurements for the ball of foot and the arch. Mine was 9.5 inches for both. And I'm going to subtract the across sole measurement from each of these numbers. Across the ball of the foot, the sole is 3.75 inches. 9.5 minus 3.75 comes to 5.75 inches. The across sole measurement at the arch comes to 3.25 inches. 9.5 minus 3.25 comes to 6.25. We'll use these 2 new measurements to mark out the top of our boot. So I want to mark 5.75 along the ball of foot line. I find the halfway point, which is around 2.8. I line it up with the centre line and I mark my measurement on either side. I repeat the same process for the arch line, finding the centre point and marking on either side. I measure from the edge of the sole to the end of the top of foot measurement. It's 0.75 inches. I use this measurement to work around the toe, making marks towards the ball of foot line. I then join all these markings together, drawing a smooth line to make the front of our boot. With that done, we just need to finish off the top. I square up from the arch line, 1 inch on either side of the centre line. I meant to come up 1 inch, but I've come up half an inch here. I realise my mistake and fix it later. Using a tape measure, I measure from the centre line along the boot front up until the corner at the arch line. Mine comes to 7.25 inches. I take that measurement and I measure from the centre line at the sole and make a mark on the sole where it comes to 7.25. And I repeat the process for the other side, measuring the boot front from the centre and marking that measurement on the sole. Now I measure from these two new marks to the centre line at the heel. Both sides come to exactly 4 inches. Now if your measurements come out slightly different, we're going to need to split the difference. In this example, one side is 4.5 inches, the other is 4.25. That's a 1/4 of an inch difference. We divide that 1/4 of an inch by 2, which is 1/8 of an inch. So we make a mark 1/8 of an inch from the centre line into the side of the larger measurement. And now we've evened out both sides. We take a new measurement from the side notches until this new notch at the back to make sure it's even and note down the new number. I draw a line along the bottom of a fresh piece of paper and then I square up my full length measurement. For me that's 8 inches. I then square across half that full length circumference. Mine was 10.5 divided by 2 is 5.25. I measure up from floor to ankle, for me that was 4 inches, and I square across that same measurement for the top of the boot. I then find the halfway point and make a mark. Now we take half our ankle circumference. Mine was 9.25 divided by 2 is 4.62. We half that again, for me that's 2.3, and we line that up with the halfway mark we made on the ankle line. And we mark our ankle measurements on either side. And I draw lines from the top of the boot to the ankle marks, and from the ankle to the heel. And this is where I realised I made my earlier mistake. I want to bring the top of this boot front up 1 inch. I measure up 1 inch and square a line 1 inch on either side of the centre line. And I join that with the outer corners. These both measure 2.5 inches. I measure from the heel up to the new boot front line, which is now 5.5 inches. I make 2 marks along the bottom of the boot, at 4 inches for the boot front to heel measurement, and at 5.5 inches for the top of the boot to heel measurement, and I square up a line at the 5.5 inches mark. I take the measurement from the diagonal line we drew from top to bottom of the boot front. Mine was 2.5 inches. And I draw a line of 2.5 inches, going from the 4-inch mark at my foot until it intersects the line we made at the 5.5 inch mark. Lastly, I connect that new point to the ankle point, and the side of my boot is done. The next thing I do is I add a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the back, along the bottom, and up the diagonal. I measure along the front of the boot to determine how long I want the tongue. It comes to about 6 inches. I square up 6 inches from the line at the top of the boot front. I did this off camera because I forgot to hit record. I copy both the sole and boot front onto tracing paper with a 1/4 inch seam allowance everywhere but the tongue. On the boot front I marked a notch along the centre front line, and on the sole I marked notches on the centre line front and back, and the 2 side lines where the boot front will meet the side. Now it's time to make a mock-up. First I stitch the 2 back pieces together. I line up the seam at the back with the back notch on the sole and pin that together. I line up the front notches on the sole and boot front. And then I make sure that front and side pieces match up with the side notch on the sole. I stitch this all together, and then I stitch up the sides. Now our mock-up is done and ready to try on. Well, it goes on, which is a good start. The sides wrap around decently. I think I need to add an extra inch or two to the tongue. It's a little bit snug around the top of the foot, so I might open this up a bit by another half an inch. I'll also take it up at the back about an inch, but that's just a style choice. So let's go make those adjustments. I'll start with the boot front. First I draw a line across where the tongue meets the boot, and I mark the centre point. I cut off the tongue, and I draw a line from the centre point to the notch on the boot front. I cut along this line right until the edge of the seam allowance, so it opens like a hinge. I take a scrap piece of paper and I mark out half an inch, which is how much I want to expand the boot front. I put the boot front piece over the scrap of paper, lining the opening up with the half-inch mark I just drew, and I tape that down. I cut off the excess paper, and I have a newly expanded boot front piece. Now I'm going to add a new tongue. I measure the old tongue, and I'm going to add 1/4 of an inch for attaching it to the boot front. That gives me 6 inches. And I decided I wanted to add 2 inches to the tongue, so I take a new piece of paper, marking up at 8 inches, and I square a line across. I measure the new opening on the boot front. That comes to 2.5 inches. I mark that out on the tongue, and I square a line down. I cut that out, and then I line that up with the seam allowance on the boot front and stick that down. And my new front piece is done. Now I'm going to add some height to my boot sides. I attach a piece of scrap paper to the top of the pattern piece, and I extend the line from the back of the boot. I then square up 1 inch from the top of the original pattern piece. I come out 1 inch, and I join this point to the top of the pattern piece, drawing a curved line. And I cut it out. I also decide to extend the edge of the boot side so that it overlaps the tongue a little bit. So I add another piece of scrap paper, and I extend the diagonal line about 1/2 inch. And I join the new point to the ankle line, and add in the seam allowance, and cut it out. Now I've made all the alterations to my pattern, I'm going to make at least one more mock-up before I cut into my precious leather. The tongue's a better length, and I have more wiggle room in the foot. I think the angle I made at the top is too steep, so I'm going to bring that down 1/2 inch. But fit-wise, I'm very happy with it, so I'm going to make a couple more alterations, but they'll be design choices rather than fit issues. I've added an extra 1/2 inch to the front top of the boot to make the curve less steep. Once again, I forgot to record. I've already rounded off the corners of the tongue, but I've decided I wanted to add more flair by bringing it in at the middle. I draw a curved line from the bottom of the tongue to the bottom of the curved corner, and I repeat on the other side. I cut this out. Then I decide to round it more at the top. I find the centre point, and I mark 1/4 of an inch on either side. I draw a curved line from that outer mark to the bottom of the corner. I fold it in half so that it's symmetrical when I cut it out. Next, I cut out the outline of the sole without seam allowance. The idea is that the sole will be 2 layers thick, but only 1 layer will be stitched to the main boot. This will make more sense in future videos, but essentially the 2 sole layers will be stitched together, with the upper layer being stitched to the main boot. Now we have most of the pieces cut out, but I'm going to make one more piece, a cuff for the top of the boot. I take a large piece of scrap paper, folded. I place the back of the boot pattern along the fold, and then I trace along the top part of the pattern piece. I add a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the bottom, and I square up 2 inches on either end, connecting them with a curved line, and adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the edge. And I cut the piece out. I then decided that I didn't need such a large seam at the edge, so I trimmed this down to 1/8 of an inch. And that's the cuff piece done. And that's the pattern all finished. We'll use those on the leather in the next video and start preparing it for sewing. If you don't want to miss that video, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!